It is rare in my arcade ports series that we come across an arcades game that has got pretty much good or extremely good home conversions across all platforms. Silkworm, just like this 1990 Jelco release of Rodland, are two exceptions in which every platform had a decent version of the game. I have covered and suffered playing some god-awful games in this series, but really can't say this about Rodland at all. It's a game that I knew of in the early 90s through seeing it advertised in Commodore Format magazine, and I never actually owned it. More on that later though. I personally don't recall it in the arcade either, but regardless, this type of cutesy colourful platformers right up my street and will appeal to Bubble Bobble and Rainbow Island fans, of which I've already covered in this series. It's a simple concept of using a magic wand to bash the living daylights out of cutesy monsters, which then progresses the player to the next stage. Two protagonists are in this game named Tam and Tit, who also create ladders which magically sparkle away as they are made. The aim of the game is to rescue the mother who was trapped in a castle. So like I said, fans of Bubble Bobble and Rainbow Islands will find this appealing as it's very similar in its basic concept of gameplay. It's a fun arcades game and has had several good home conversions like I've said. So today we are ranking from worst to best of the home conversions of Rodland. People might laugh at Spectrum games, especially those outside of the UK who didn't grow up with one. I didn't grow up with a Spectrum, although later on I went to have pretty much every model, and these days I've even built my own modern ZX Spectrum from scratch. I love it and appreciate it as a part of computing history. Those who laughed, I often think of that Liam Lynch song, United States or whatever. So how is the 1991 Storm software conversion? Well, quite possibly one of the Spectrum's best arcade ports, right next to Rainbow Islands. This is one smooth and flicker-free home conversion for the 128K Spectrum models. Granted, no music, but some great sound effects here. In between gameplay and at the start, we are greeted with some very nicely drawn up graphics, which resembles the arcades game, nicely complete with music. As for the black backgrounds and white outlines of characters and scenery, granted, Rodland is a colourful game and clearly the Spectrum couldn't pull this off. But as for fluid gameplay with really nice controls, I think that makes up for it. If you had a ZX Spectrum back in the day and happened to be playing this on a black and white portable TV, you wouldn't have noticed a difference anyways. I did find that sprites were fairly fast on this conversion, making it a fairly challenging port of the game. Released back in 1991, developed by Doomsday Machine and published by Storm, the Amstrad CPC conversion was programmed using Mode 0, which is why we got a beautifully presented game here. Amstrad fans watching this video will be thankful that recently I've praised a few games for this platform. As we know, the Amstrad CPC got its more than fair share of terrible arcade home conversions, but that isn't the case here for Rodland. For an 8-bit machine, this game looks great and to an extent it plays well too. So on with the not so great. Firstly, we have no music here, sound effects only, which to be honest don't actually sound that bad. Secondly, we had to wait for the disc to load each stage. If you had this game on cassette, then I would imagine this was even worse. Thirdly, it is on the laggy side, although for sure it's playable and very enjoyable to play. Fourthly, the 1990 arcades game would see Tam and Rip fly into the next screen, but here, like I say, we do have to wait for stages to load up instead. In terms of hit collision detection, this is really spot on and the controls are really tight too when hitting out with your wand and making ladders appear. Overall, a very bright and colourful home conversion, which many likely would have enjoyed playing back in the day. And like I always say on these nice looking Amstrad CPC games, you missed out if you had a green screen monitor. This is one game I wanted as a kid, which released smack on my era of Commodore 64, which was 1991, but it never happened. If you remember, the early 90s in the UK, Toys R Us were pretty much the only place selling the big releases, mainly on the Hit Squad label. corner shops mainly sold the cheap budget games. I've seen this advertised time and time again in Commodore Format magazine, but never found it, and mail ordering seems very sketchy back in those dark age days. Anyways, this Storm release is very good, or at least the best of the 8-bit computer versions. Some have argued that it appears to be unfinished because of lack of background imagery and music, and I am pretty sure these could have been implemented into the game, but it wasn't. Likely memory constraints, I'm not sure. It's a lovely play and very smooth indeed. I didn't notice any sprite flicker here at all. I also appreciate that the coder added the travelling to the next stage animation here, even though it's always travelling upwards. The thought was there and it looks really cool. Bombs that explode in the game are pixelated but seems to do the trick. Overall, a very decent C64 conversion that was right up in my street in the early 90s. I got to play it years later, so better late than never. Now, the issue we have here is a case of a really awesome Game Boy game, which, in true British style, a jolly good play, old boy. But the issue why I can't rank this any higher is due to the fact that this is a multi-scrolling game, and of course the arcades game was actually just single screen. Regardless, this is a super great Game Boy game that released in 1993 by Jalco Entertainment. It is very faithful to the arcades game, considering this is a handheld version with a tiny 2.6-inch screen. The music and sound effects here are excellent and just so joyful to listen to. The gameplay is super smooth and includes an awesome introduction with the Looking for Mum storyline. One thing it is missing is flying to various stages. Instead, this version fades out and into subsequent stages. If you had this back in the day, I am jealous. I must have had my first Game Boy around 1993, but don't recall seeing this one for sale. Anyways, I was too busy hooked with Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins. What a game. In true Nintendo Entertainment System style, we have a fairly unique version of Rodland. Although the same mechanics are here and the same principles of beating enemies with a wand are still here, this is scaled down with fairly mediocre gameplay. The music has been changed completely here, possibly a copyright issue, and the backgrounds are generally blue with some bland looking clouds scattered around here and there. It does of course suffer at times tremendously with sprite flicker as per usual for NES games. This version released in 1993 by Jalco Entertainment, which was a fairly late release for a then 8-year-old console. If you want to see how NES games are unique compared with other versions, with NES that is, I seriously urge you to check out my arcade ports video on Altered Beast. The NES version of that will truly blow your mind. Anyways, like I say, a fairly average game, but definitely not one of the Nintendo NES's best games. Atari ST users had a superb port of Rodlands, which released in 1991, again by Storm. This is a great game, and it's actually refreshing to say this about an Atari ST arcades conversion. As many of you are aware, most ST games were fairly bad. Again, just like the Amstrad CPC, not here. This is a very faithful 16-bit game that is fun to play and includes flying the stages rather than fading out or waiting for the next stage to load up. The music and sound effects combined are really well done here. I have found in the past that Atari ST games would drown out the music when sound effects take place, but this is well balanced here. As you can see from the gameplay footage, this is one brightly coloured game. The only issue with this is that it does suffer from frame rates occasionally, particularly when bombs exploding too much is happening at once on screen. I have seen much worse for the Atari ST, and it really isn't that bad, truth be told. The backgrounds are also cheery and faithful looking to the arcades game. Yup, this is definitely up there as one of the ST's proudest moments. Now, if you thought the Atari ST port was pretty good, then the Commodore Amiga's version triples its greatness and provides an almost arcade-perfect release. Well, as far as 16-bit home computers were concerned, and that's why I'm ranking this version in first place. This version is so good, it is often said to be one of the best platformers on the Amiga, full stop. It's so faithfully ported that even flying around to different stages is done the right way here. The first couple of stages, for example, fly you over to the right, followed by flying upwards. It's more colourful than the ST version, and the music is just wow. When people who were likely brought up with a console and claim that home computers were terrible, I play games like this one on the Amiga and I chuckle at those type of comments. This could be considered as console-like quality and wouldn't look at a place on the Super Nintendo. It's responsive to control, shooting ladders gives us a really funky, bright, sparkly cloud before generating the ladders. It's silky smooth, no sprite flickering. Really, you need to play this version just to appreciate the pure brilliance and genius behind it. So that's it for today's ranking the various different home conversions of the very awesome Rodland. This one's been requested a hell of a lot in the past and I finally got around to it. So which version would you have put in top spot? Do you agree with me that the Amiga deserved this? Which version did you play growing up? Which one did you enjoy most playing? Anyways, until next video arrives, thanks for watching. A little while back I uploaded an arcade ports video for St. Dragon. Many people hadn't heard of this arcade shoot 'em up classic. Many were mentioning a similar game by the name of Dragon Breed. This one released by IREM for arcades back in 1989. It's similar to St. Dragon in that we can use our dragon to block off enemy attacks. The difference here is that instead of a robotic dragon though, we are playing as the character King Chaos riding a dragon. It's a horizontal shooter and we get some really cool power-ups to enhance firepower. We can even spit out fireballs with this game. So the storyline is much like this. Chaos become the king of Agamemnon Empire at 15 years old. People who didn't agree with his enthronement conspired to break the seal to unleash the King of Darkness. The kingdom is now overrun with evil, and so King Chaos with his Dragon of Light, also referred to as Bahamut, seeks to return peace to the kingdom. It's a great shooter with nicely detailed and fairly large sprites. The tail of the dragon looks amazing as it twists and turns in the gameplay. In terms of difficulty level, the original arcades game is a fair challenge. So today we are checking out the different home conversions of IREM's horizontal school and shoot 'em up Dragon Breed. Be prepared, there is some true shockers in this one. This is one awful arcades conversion for the ZX Spectrum. Wouldn't even say this was enjoyable. I literally played it for this video as part of the ranking. I just had to include it because that is the point of these arcade port videos after all. So what is wrong with this game? Well, this atrocious game by Activision released in 1990 had pretty much everything wrong with it. Now, to be fair, I played the next version in this video first, expecting it to be the worst. But actually, the Spectrum's version surprised me of how damn slow it played. The noise that it produced, the overly large sprites on the small gameplay screen. I died many times playing the first stage and didn't even make it to the boss. I can easily play the arcade game's first stage without losing a life. But here, I must have gotten through 3 continues and didn't even get to the boss. It's clunky to control, sprites are stiff and look awkward too. It's likely the worst Spectrum shooter I've ever played. Really, just terrible. It has no introduction where Chaos jumps onto the dragon, and just like the next version in this video, it kind of looks like it has an R-type backgrounds going on. The Amstrad CPC's 1991 Activision release is kind of playable to an extent, or rather more playable than the Spec's version. The issue is here is that although the developers aimed for larger sprites to imitate the arcades game, we have got a fairly small gameplay screen, and so avoiding enemies and projectiles can be hard work. I would imagine that this was ported over from the ZX Spectrum, which was very common. It's normally the Spectrum style colours which are the giveaway when this happens. As you can see, we have no background here, and of course, the original arcades game had some really nice background imagery of apocalyptic wastegrounds. Here we just have what kind of looks like a space shooter with glittering stars, a bit like the Spectrum's version. We get no introduction here where King Chaos walks along to take control of the dragon. I found this version much more challenging than the 1989 Iron game. That was likely down to its slow frame rates and increased difficulty because sprites were too large and they were shooting at me with not enough room to avoid projectiles. If this had a bigger gameplay area, or if the sprites were scaled down a touch, this could have been half decent. There is no music, just sound effects which don't really sound that impressive for a 1991 Amstrad release. I won't say that this wasn't a tough version of Dragon Breed to play, because it really was. So for a couple of good things first, we had the same style opening stages, with stage 1 appearing followed by the Dragon Claw marks, which adds to the arcade authenticity. The backgrounds are nicely drawn out here too. We also have a nice animation when Chaos is hit, he explodes when lightning strikes upwards and downwards. Not as visually striking as the arcade game, but it works. We get a choice of either music or sound effects with the ST's conversion, which I personally thought was shocking since the Commodore 64 managed to pull both of these off simultaneously. The mighty SID chip beating a 16-bit computer, how on earth did that happen? Okay, so the gameplay itself, I will be honest, the toughness of this version is painful at times. The issue is here of what has happened to most other ports of this game. The screen is dominated with larger scaled sprites, and very little room to dodge projectiles, which are also scaled up here in size. The Atari ST also struggles at times when too much is happening at once. I think that the gameplay for the Commodore 64 version will do most of the talking here when comparing it with the last couple of 8-bit awful conversions. I must say, a smile appeared on my face to be playing a version of Dragon Breed which was half playable. Firstly, we have the music and some subtle sound effects. Granted, the music isn't the best music on the Commodore 64, but it is something and kind of sounds similar to the arcade game itself. Now, of course, the biggest difference here compared to the other two 8-bit computer versions is the background imagery. Now, as we know, Commodore 64's color palette is kind of dull, but that kind of works to Dragon Breed's advantage in a way. Dragon Breed isn't meant to look like Mr. Blobbyland after all, so these dull colours can kind of be excused here to an extent. You will notice that the dragon flickers a hell of a lot. That isn't a wonderful attribute to this version, granted, but it works and controls really nicely as we have plenty of manoeuvre room here as everything has been scaled down, which to be fair works much better than Amstrad and Spectrum's large sprite and small gameplay screen issues. I even made it to the first boss here, which I will say that unlike the arcade game where the boss emerges as part of the first stage, we actually meet the first boss here with a fade out and fade in. Really though, without an ounce of a doubt, the C64 1990s conversion wins this 8-bit micro battle. This version even comes with a better introduction too. Okay, so we don't see Chaos walk into the dragon like in the arcade game, but we get an awesome rock which is erupting. And in first place we have the Commodore Amiga's 1990 release. Now let me say, by no means this is a perfect conversion, but it is, in my humble opinion, the best of what we got for home conversions. The difficulty level of this one is also sky high. The things this version did do right was giving us a larger gameplay area. Although the sprites are on the larger side, which I think should have been toned down a touch here to allow for better gameplay, much like the Commodore 64 versions did. By no means is it overcrowded as badly as the Atari ST's version was. Now, we do have some slight slowdowns here when too much is happening at once, but generally, it is a fairly smooth experience of Dragon Breed. Sadly, we only have a choice of music or sound effects here in the game, which I chose music, and have to say that the music is by far superior to the Atari ST's version. Colours are fairly nice and bright here. Controlling the dragon is pretty good too. Like I say, by no means a great version, as again, I don't think Dragon Breed particularly had a great version to play at home. Just like most other versions, the difficulty level is ridiculously tough here, but I did manage to make it to the second stage, so not as challenging as other versions. It opens up like the Atari ST's version with the stage 1 Dragon Claw animation, but sadly we also don't see Chaos running to hop on the dragon here either as the game starts. As we know, this only got ported to 5 platforms. I am pretty confident to say that if the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis had a conversion of this game, it would likely have been a really good one compared with everything else that was officially released at the time. So anyways, that's it for ranking the various different ports of Dragon Breed today. Which version was you unfortunate enough to have? Or did you actually enjoy your version of Dragon Breed, say on the Commodore 64? It's a very disappointing bunch of home conversions and probably one of the worst bunch of conversions I played in my series so far. Let us know in the comments what you played growing up and which would you put in first place. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. This one has been requested many times as part of my arcade port series, so today we are checking out the many different versions of Pang, which is known by a couple of different names around the world, such as Pumping Worlds for Japan and Buster Bros for the USA. The game was a straight up success when releasing in the arcades back in 1989. It was a partnership of both Capcom and Mitchell Corporation who brought us this masterpiece. This action shoot 'em up platformer title was a very simple idea, yet so addictive to play. It's generally those basic ideas which has a uniqueness at the time which are still widely talked about and loved today. Pac-Man and Space Invaders, for example, with those basic ideas. So if you are new to old games or a veteran like myself, I'll give you a brief rundown of Pang, which is what I will widely refer to it as throughout this video. Shoot at balloons which bounce. When shot, they multiply and reduce in size. One hit, you are dead. The game gives us a multitude of weapons to aid the player, and various other goodies, including things which makes the timer stop. In the original arcade game, there are 50 stages which span across 17 backdrops, which represents different part of the world. I will say that majority of conversions in this video allow 2 player simultaneous gameplay too. The physics used for the balloons are very impressive. The colours used in music are cheerful and popping sounds awesome with the arcade game. So today we are checking out the many different home conversions of Pang. You'll likely ask why isn't the Super NES version here, because many times people won't listen to these introductions and likely skip this part. Well, just for info, Pang for Super Nintendo was known as Super Buster Bros and was a sequel, so won't be included. Anyways, we got some balloons to pop. It breaks me to admit it, but I think the Commodore 64's version isn't the strongest port of Pang. There, I said it, hit that dislike button now. Let me give you the reasoning then. Well, Pang is known to be a fast-paced arcades game with balloons that bounce about smoothly. The issue here with the Commodore 64's Ocean 1991 release, which came out on cartridge, is that it does suffer frame issues. It just cannot handle too much going on at once. I know this port is praised, but I am just being honest. Remember, we are looking for the best port of Pang, and this just doesn't cut it. Now, on with the goods. Well, it controls nicely, and it has really nice backgrounds too, complete with fairly good music. Sound effects are a little on the quiet side, but it is noticeable. We have a really nice introduction to the game where it tells us how to play Pang. Now, back to the bad. The balloons themselves just come across as circles. There isn't any colour on them to give them that rounded look. I also found this version incredibly frustrating to play compared with other versions. It's the version which I died the most in too. Now, personally, I felt the Game Boy's conversion was a little better to play than the Commodore 64's port. It's bizarre, I know, but although this port does suffer a little more with frame drops, it just oddly felt easier to play, and I didn't find myself swearing when dying, which wasn't much with this version. Of course, it's far from perfect on a smaller screen and a lack of colours, but we even have a cute ending screen for each stage, and the balloons, although smaller in size, actually had a rounded look to them. The music isn't bad for a portable version, and the sound effects are pretty good here too. It controls well enough, and sprite collision detection is very good here. I don't know, I just can't put my finger on why this version seemed better than the C64's port. But anyways, I will get a dislike for this choice, but remember, this isn't anything official, just my humble opinion. If you have access to both of these versions, seriously, play them and let me know in the comments if you agree with me here. Ocean's 1990 release of Pang for the ZX Spectrum 128K models is a damn good conversion. You might think that with so much happening on screen at once, such as 4 to 5 large balloons independently bouncing around at once, you might think this would possibly slow down or even give some flicker, but nothing here really too significant. The physics of balloons here and how smooth they bounce is pure perfection, 8-bit style. This is a conversion that deserves recognition. It is so faithful to the arcade's release, it includes music and sound effects both combined, and these sound pretty good if you ask me, especially the sounds of balloons popping. I'll always say this, but if you aren't a fan of Spectrum's visuals, appreciate this game for being a technical achievement in its own right. It's so faithful to what it is aiming to achieve. It goes as far as including a really nice map, as well as a funky looking anime character, which displays after completing each stage. This really is a game for the Spectrum, which is high up there with some of the greatest games of all time on the platform. Now, if you've been watching my arcade port series, you'll likely see a theme with Atari ST games having at times slow frame rates. Yes, the 1992 Ocean version isn't perfect by any means, with those menacing balloons ready to kick your ass, but the ST does really well at making so much happen at once here. The game itself does its very best to stay on track with what it is copying over for the ST's version fairly well. As you can see, this is a bright, colourful and charming version of Pang. The music and sound effects are both excellent here. It controls nicely and we have that nice rounded shape for things. Yes, I will not let that Commodore 64's version go. I wouldn't say one of the best ST games of all time, but it likely is high up there as being a good port at least. Backdrops, as you can see here, look stunning, and can only imagine how much better this would have looked on a colour ST monitor back in the day. Everything here is fairly faithful to the arcades game, including a nicely drawn out map and stage completion presentations. Now, if you have never seen the Amstrad's conversion of this, it is likely one of the best Amstrad arcade ports ever made, and it is highly praised for being such a superb version of Pang. I have a couple of subscribers on my channel, always comments, I look forward to the day when I see an Amstrad game getting in first place. Well, not quite here, not in my personal opinion anyways, but having said that, I ranked it above the Spectrum and Commodore 64's conversions, and even a 16-bit machine. But really, Amstrad GX 4000, 464 Plus and 6128 Plus users would have been over the moon with this game on its release. It's one of those historical moments where Amstrad finally had a port which was class and still is class as arcade perfection. Well, in terms of 8-bit arcade perfection. This port released back in 1991 by Ocean and controlled extremely smoothly. Balloons bounce around smoothly. There is a slight frame drop occasionally, but nothing significant. It's a serious great version all around. The reason I have ranked it here is that there are some slightly better versions to come, which look a little brighter and sound better too. But overall, absolutely no criticism of this conversion. A technical achievement for sure. I will also note here that there was a reworking of this game known as Pang Plus, which improves on a few things with this version. Give it a Google search. Now, although this version doesn't look as nice as the Atari ST's port, it plays so much nicer, and seriously, a game like Pang where we need the uttermost precision when shooting at balloons is much easier to play without those frame drops. This 1993 release by Hudson is actually titled as Buster Bros. You'll notice by comparing this with the ST's version, the ST game looks much nicer in terms of sprites and backdrops, but this one plays much nicer too and just felt like a very smooth experience all around. I actually got further with this version too, and I found it fairly enjoyable to play. Well, not so much stress at all with this version compared with others I played in this video. So we got some notable mentions now, and the first one is MSX. So I thought I'd include this 1983 release of Cannonball for the MSX, as this is where Pang really began. As you can see, it's virtually the same game, only of course this is much more basic in terms of its visuals, and the gameplay itself is nowhere near as refined as most versions that later released as Pang. 1983 also seen a ZX Spectrum version of this game, which originally came out on MSX, although this version was known as Bubble Buster, just like the MSX version, only slightly nicer to play with the balloons looking a little nicer here too. Buster Bros Collection was a PlayStation compilation comprising of 3 different Pang games, which included the original arcades game. This is a direct arcade emulated version, and so was not ranked. The only difference with this version is that it didn't use the same music as the arcade game, but rather a MIDI audio sound. It released in 1997 by Capcom. And in first place we have the Commodore Amiga's conversion. Okay, so the Commodore Amiga's 1990 Ocean port is almost the same as the Atari ST's version, only this version runs much more smoothly, and the music and sound effects are much better here as usual for the old-fashioned, old-school Amiga versus Atari ST scenario, in this arcade port series at least. I would also say, sound-wise, this actually sounds much fresher than the original arcade game itself too. Kind of an upgrade, so to speak. And talking of upgrades, the balloons themselves seems a little rounder here, where we don't have as much pixelation or jagged edges going around the balloons themselves. There is ever so slight frame drops occasionally, but easily these seem nothing at all when compared to the Atari ST's counterpart. Walking up ladders is also silky smooth here, and hitting the balloons themselves seems a little more fluid as they pop and begin to multiply. The Amiga did have some almost arcade perfect conversions, and this was definitely one of them. Just like the ST version, we can also change difficulty levels with this version, which admittedly I even struggled with the easiest mode. I'm just a terrible player at Pang really. I am confident that this video will be debated over my rankings, especially Commodore 64's version being what I considered as the worst port. So regardless of that, which version do you think should have ranked at number 1? Are you of the Amstrad opinion? Do you think Amstrad's CPC or GX4000 version should have ranked at number 1? Just remember, I like to do things differently. I don't copy other people's lists. This is actually a natural opinion how I rank my arcade ports videos. But anyways, as always, drop us a comment and let us know if you enjoyed Pang on your platform, whichever that might have been back in the day. But anyways, for everyone has asked for this one, it's been hell putting this together. I'm not the greatest player of Pang. But anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. When we refer to old games being challenging games, Contra, or Gryzor as it's known in Europe, is a true definition of it. This 1987 Konami arcade game is a defining run and gun game that is likely one of the most popular games of all time in this genre. The game is presented in the typical 1980s action film style, and its artwork was actually based around a particular scene from the Predator film. Contra, which I'll refer to as throughout this video, has a couple of different styles of gameplay, running gun platforming as well as 3D elements or pseudo 3D elements which are ridiculously tough at times. It is a fairly impressive game for its time, complete with parallax scrolling. I will note here that the Nintendo Entertainment System's game is known as Probotector in parts of the world. Of course, originally the arcade game was presented as a vertical centralized game, and some might argue that a particular version of the arcade game is superior in many ways. If you happen to still be with me at this point, you will likely comment that a particular version might not be here. Let's just face it, Contra, Gryzor or Probotector has been on so many gadgets and systems over the years, most of which are just emulator versions rather than conversions. So we're going to stick with the main releases here from back in the day. We are strictly sticking with the 1987 arcade original, so no countless sequels or spin-offs. Otherwise, this video could last for a solid few hours. This video is ranking from worst to best of likely the world's greatest running gun, as requested by many people out there. What would you say if I said this DOS version of Contra was the best game ever made? Honestly, I don't think even the most seasoned DOS gamers of the late 80s would consider this version any good. It simply shouldn't have been made full stop. It is ugly, terrible to control, sounds just awful. Really, since the developers put little effort into this version, I am putting little effort into this review. I personally wouldn't even consider this a worthy entry. The Amstrad's 1988 Ocean port is definitely up there as a difficult version of what is an already really difficult game. The biggest issue with the Amstrad CPC conversion is its single screen format rather than the original multi-scrolling format. When we make it to the next screen, bullets can suddenly be fired down at you, not giving you much reaction time to avoid it. The controller layout isn't that great here either, it just doesn't seem to be smooth at all to play. If I press down on the joystick, it will literally make our character jump to the level below. So to duck or lie down to shoot enemies, fire button needs to be pressed whilst holding joystick down. Diagonal shooting also seems a little off here too. Don't think about shooting downwards here either because you simply can't do it. We cannot even jump and shoot both at once here. Now graphically and in terms of sprites, it's not a bad looking Amstrad game. Obviously fairly pixelated and there is no parallax scrolling used here. It's just really let down badly by the controls used here. Once I get to the 3D stages, the controls actually seemed a little better here, although the difficulty got even worse at this point. There is no music with this version, just sound effects, which makes it seem a little lifeless. And of course, the original game had the vertical aspect ratio, where this version doesn't. Commodore 64 had two versions of this game. This could be the case for particular arcades conversions for C64 back in the day. Both games were developed by Colin Porch and David Blade. For the European market, Ocean published it as Gryzor, and for its American release it was known as Contra and was published by Konami. Some loved this version, some hate it. It seems that many are just put off by its very strange control system. The keyboard acted as the jump button, whereas the joystick did the rest. I have to admit this could have been coded entirely just for joystick, but Contra isn't the only C64 game to receive this strange control layout. So in terms of gameplay, I found this version much easier to play than the Amstrad's version. Although the controls were a little strange initially, I got the hang of it eventually. It controlled okay, but by no means am I saying it's perfect. You literally cannot shoot downwards with this version. Just like a couple of other versions, we cannot shoot whilst jumping here either. The level designs are as faithful as it can be, although no parallax scrolling here either. Admittedly, there are prettier looking Commodore 64 games around, and this game is fairly smooth, but does suffer from some slight frame drops to be expected. We also have a fairly good rendition of the arcade music, and we also have sound effects combined here too, so we get the best of both worlds there. It is pixelated, but overall a fairly good conversion, which I won't say groundbreaking, it's just average if anything. I found it difficult to place a ZX Spectrum version of Contra. Obviously not perfect, but this seemed to play better than the previous version so far in this video. We don't have an exploding bridge here, but at least it's there anyways. Some versions didn't even have a bridge. The good thing with this conversion is the ability to shoot whilst jumping, and at times it is well needed too. It offers no parallax scrolling, but many Spectrum games didn't have this due to hardware restraints. One particularly strange feature here is that at the end of the first part of stage 1, normally the fortified building before going into the second part gives us an almost boss part of the game with turrets to destroy and enemies to kill. Not here though. The ZX Spectrum 128K game just requires us to shoot it a couple of times with no bullets to avoid and then just simply blows up. Going back to the first part of the game, yeah, it's a ZX Spectrum looking game, and in certain points it is difficult to see projectiles being aimed at us because of colour clash. Some Spectrum games had it worse than others. A yellow background with black outlines, for example, with black bullets being fired into the same area is very messy here. The game surprisingly flickers a fair amount too for a Spectrum game. I personally think that although it has the colour clash, it is a fairly decent port complete with music and sound effects. It really isn't as bad as you might think it would be by looking at this. Likely the easiest version of Contra out there, this MSX2 cartridge release was a Japanese exclusive that released in 1989 by Konami. Of course, the level design is slightly different here. The iconic bridge blowing up isn't here, and it is a single screen game which offers no parallax scrolling effects, but it actually plays really well. Something which makes this a fairly good version is that we are not constantly bombarded with bullets. The music and sound effects are nicely done here, the colours used are decent enough, very much in the style of a NES game, and the music too. I found this really enjoyable to play and even found the 3D stages fairly easy to play through too. Things do look different here compared to many other versions, such as when dying you kind of slip backwards, and when blasting capsules for power-ups rather than bouncing, these tend to jump up and land in the same position. Something else which is different is when we get a weapon power-up, we actually get a choice menu of which weapon to select, almost like an RPG element. Although it's not arcade accurate and does have these differences, the game is smooth to play compared to, say, the Amstrad's version, which also did the single screen format rather than the original multi-scrolling format. There is some strange goings-ons in the MSX2 release, where sprites will randomly appear where gravity doesn't seem to exist. But considering the other fairly bad versions of Contra or Gryzor, this MSX2 version isn't that bad considering. You all knew this was coming in first place. In fact, as I played through this NES 1988 Konami conversion, I suddenly thought, what was the point in this video? I like to do things different on this channel, but really, the NES port is seriously up there for more than one reason. Okay, so it's not arcade perfection at all, but it is much closer to it than, say, the MSX2 port. Sure, stage layouts are slightly different and 3D stages are slightly different too, but there is a reason that this version is often said to be better than the arcade game itself, because it truly is. I think this is the main version which most people have fond memories of rather than the arcade original. I find that the NES version is often talked about rather than the source material itself, to the point I am often left thinking, are people even aware that Contra started off as an arcade game originally? This game is also known by the name Probotector in different parts of the world. It's a decent multi-scrolling running gun game. It does suffer with some sprite flicker, but not as bad as some NES games could get at times. It sounds great and sound effects are awesome here too. We can shoot whilst jumping, weapon capsules look great, it's slightly pixelated, but most edges are more rounded off than other versions where objects and sprites looked jagged around the edges. Like I say, although this isn't 100% arcade perfection in terms of how it looks at times, the argument here could be that other versions weren't arcade perfect either. Even though some versions look more like it, they mainly failed a couple of crucial things, which was having the ability to jump and shoot both at once, having no scrolling screen, or just having issues shooting downwards. So considering all these issues with the other home conversions, I think it is safe to say this is likely the next best thing to the arcade game itself. And that's it for ranking the various different ports of Contra or Gryzor or Probotector today. Which version do you think should have ranked it number 1? Are you thoroughly with me on this and say that the Nintendo NES deserves its place here? Which version did you have growing up? Was you lumbered with the IBM DOS PC version, which was just, well, shocking? If you did have this version, did you actually like it or pretend you liked it? Anyways, for everyone who's asked for this, I've finally done it. And until next time, thanks for watching. This is the 50th episode in the arcade port series, and so I thought I'd do a ports video on one of the most famous top-down vertical scrolling shooters of all time. This is Ikari Warriors, which released in arcades in 1986 by the one and only SNK. Now let me tell you, we have some truly bad home conversions in this video. There will likely be platforms it was on that you wasn't aware of. Yes, this game released on pretty much everything during the 1980s. One particular version that the USA got was so awful it baffled me how it was released at all. So the game itself, although similar to Commando, which I've already covered in the past, this game featured rotary joysticks as well as a 2-player co-op mode. The game was originally designed to be an official licensed arcades game for Rambo First Blood Part 2, which I personally say the greatest Rambo film of all time. The scene where John blows up the helicopter after pretending he was dead was just awesome. So SNK were unable to get the rights and release this as Ikari Warriors. So as always, we are ranking from worst to best, and let me remind you, if you don't agree with my rankings, please act responsibly. Nobody wants to read comments of fully grown men sounding like men children. We are adults, people. An absolute disgrace of a Commodore 64 game. To make matters worse, this American release actually had the cheat to ask people to pay for this. I will put it like this, there is better highly polished shoot 'em up destruction public domain games than this. I mean, really, where do I start? Let's start by starting the game to have an enemy who looks like he is having a fit as he walks left and right in his own world. You walk through the game, generally the game centralizes your sprite to give us a view of enemies to come. Here, we almost walk to the top of the screen in which you can easily get hit. The music is embarrassing for a Commodore 64 game. I mean, just look at it. Thankfully, the European market got a much better version of Ikari Warriors. This trash released in 1986 by Data East. Lord have mercy if you had this version back in the day. Can you actually believe it that the Atari 2600 got a port of Ikari Warriors in 1989 by Atari Corporation? Sure, now you might laugh at this, but if you look closer and listen to it, you'll realise for a 1977 home console, which sported some of the most basic games, this is actually an achievement. If you know about the 1970s hardware, firstly, the sprites are really nicely animated here and have different shades rather than just one blocky colour. Yes, it looks rudimentary, and yes, it doesn't much resemble that arcades game, but come on, little details included here is that when we are walking through rivers, the programmer has actually chopped off the player's legs to give us depth. Control-wise, it's slightly wooden admittedly, holding down fire button throws grenades. Collision detection is fairly good here. It is likely the most basic you will get of Ikari Warriors, with a constant loop of what you see progressively getting more difficult as you go on, like most Atari 2600 games. Now, if you were into bad games and find them quirky and fun to play, this is the Apple II's Data East 1987 release. Again, just like the Atari 2600, this machine released in 1977 too, and so to have a game releasing 10 years into the computer's life is fairly impressive, let alone a game like Ikari Warriors, which is a fairly demanding game, even for a higher end computer of the 1980s. So as you can see, if you are familiar with the colours used on Apple II games, this is no exception, much like the ZX Spectrum in uniqueness that is. There is no opening to the game, you can control either joystick or keyboards to play, and the game starts straight away pretty much. Controlling is a little on the wooden side and hit collision detection is a little wonky, but the point is, it kind of resembles what it is going for to achieve. The gameplay area seems narrow just like the arcade game. Getting inside the tanks is also a little odd to control, no music here, just very basic sound effects used. Not many people likely realise, but the Commodore 16 and Commodore Plus 4 models had a conversion of Ikari Warriors, releasing back in 1987 by Elite. Let's just consider that the Commodore Plus 4 had very basic hardware for games, unlike the C64. These Commodore computers were mainly aimed at businesses and education, so to pull off a game like this isn't a bad attempt at all. If you watch my Russian Attack ports video, you will truly realise how polished this game looks. It's not great, and I did find myself dying even if I didn't get shot. I'd literally just stand a few millimeters away from the enemy from time to time and I'll just randomly die. So collision detection is pretty bad here really, but when it works it's not that bad, everything considering what this is actually running on. Again, no introduction to the game, no music, fairly rudimentary sound effects, it's missing bits and pieces of scenery, but our hero actually moves like he does in the arcade game. Compared with the IBM PC's version of Contra that I uploaded yesterday, then Ikari Warriors is a game light years ahead of this. Is it perfect? No, not at all, but to be fair, it actually doesn't look that bad for a DOS arcade conversion. For those who have been watching all of these videos of arcade ports in this series, you had seen over time some really bad DOS games or DOS conversions. It is on the slow side in terms of frame rates, but it does the job to an extent. We also get no introduction with airplane crashing into the jungle. It is basic, but at least it is following the narrow formula of gameplay. I particularly like grenades being launched here. The death of them being thrown doesn't look bad at all. Hit collision detection is pretty good here. Not the best, but a step in the right direction. No music, just some bland sound effects. Data East published this one back in 1987. I was kind of optimistic about the Atari 7800's port of this game, as when I tested and uploaded my Commando ports video sometime back, the 7800 port was actually pretty good. Now I won't say that this game is terrible, it looks good, especially the crashing airplane sequence prior to the game beginning. The colours are pretty nice here too. The real issue with this 1990 port by Atari Corporation is its pure insane difficulty level. We get an option with this version to change difficulty levels. I played it on Novice. This setting just felt like the difficulty level selection either didn't work or was just there for show. Seriously, this version was very tough. Bullets flying everywhere and grenades being repeatedly launched by enemies. The music wasn't that great either. The 7800 could actually do better in this. The sound effects, which were also combined in the gameplay, wasn't too wonderful either. When shooting enemies, it felt a little off, where it wasn't clear if I actually killed enemies, as they do a staggering effect similar to the arcade game, but here it just looked odd and was a little bit confusing. Now, this will likely be an instant dislike for this video, but dear lord, I couldn't believe what I was playing with this 1987 SNK release for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It looks great, but looks can be deceiving. This is awful to play. It is stiff to control and ridiculously slow, to the point where even for a Nintendo NES game, this isn't entertaining at all. It's likely the most janky NES game I've ever played. I normally have a very good idea in this port series of where particular systems will likely rank. I left the NES version of Ikari Warriors until last. I really had no idea how terrible this version was. If you haven't played this version, give it a go and you'll see what I mean. It doesn't particularly start great either with the airplane crash animation. Even this is janky to watch in itself. A little bit like the Nintendo Entertainment System's conversion, the Atari ST suffered the same fate. Looks are deceiving. The only reason I have ranked this version here is that it looks much like the arcade game, but by no means this is a fast-paced game. Although the NES port was particularly bad, and this one a little worse with frame rate issues, this one actually seemed to play and look a little better. I think it is a fact at this point that Atari ST games couldn't scroll too well whilst dealing with many things happening at once at the same time. Ikari Warriors clearly shows this. This version released by Elite in 1988. All I can say here is that it's such a shame that the gameplay was so slow here, because despite this, it looks really nice. The sprites themselves are really nicely detailed too, with the tanks also looking particularly nice. Every now and then, I get people whining because I place an Amstrad as the worst version of a particular arcade game port. Today, you are in luck. I think the Elite 1987 release is pretty damn good. Sure, it suffers from frame drops, but in general, it's a fairly decent version, which is fairly good to control too. There is no music here. I played this with sound effects and it doesn't sound too bad. The colours are really nice, and the best part of this version is that the coder actually put this into an almost vertical ratio, just like the arcade original game. Throwing grenades is good and responsive, and that explosion sounds brilliant when blowing up buildings. It's a fairly challenging game. It's definitely up there with some of the best Amstrad CPC home arcade conversions. Sadly, it doesn't come with the main introduction airplane crash sequence, but considering how good this Amstrad game is, I totally forgive it. I found this ZX Spectrum version difficult to rank between this and the Amstrad CPC conversion. I decided this just seemed overly better to control, especially when controlling the tank. It does lag a little from time to time, but overall a quicker, fast-paced game compared with the Amstrad's version. Sure, the colours are there and we have some sound effects, but overly, this port just seemed much better to play in general. Elite released this 48 and 128K Spectrum game back in 1988. Shooting at enemies just seemed a lot easier and nicer in this version. Rather than doing the awkward staggering away, they just stand in one single space and just pretty much spin around and die, so there's no weird staggering effect here used. It's also gone for the narrow vertical look, like the arcade original. Blowing up buildings with grenades is also pretty satisfying here. I will note here that originally a Spectrum game was actually written in 1986 before this version, but was never released. This is the version of Ikari Warriors that America would have loved back in the late 1980s. This is Ikari Warriors European style. All I'll say is, damn, this version is one of the hardest games around. As a kid, I loved to play the game, which was simply called Arnie, and for some reason, this game reminded me of it. Not that it's an isometric game, maybe it's sprite design, who knows. Despite its toughness, it looks like a premium game of that era. Music is really nicely done here, of course, and the sound effects are really good too. It took me a few attempts to get to grips of how the enemies engage, and after finding their patterns of movement, yeah, it's really good version of this game. We don't have that vertical centralized look here, but it does its best to look similar to the source material. It controls really well too, and again, just like the Amstrad and Spectrum ports, this one feels good bombing things. Any boy growing up in the 1980s loved destruction. Let's face it, action films and blowing up stuff was a major part of popular culture back in those days. Elite honoured the European market with this in 1988. So SNK themselves developed their MSX2 conversion back in 1987. This is a great 8-bit conversion and likely the best overall 8-bit port for Ikari Warriors. Yes, the music is terrible, but we have some voice synth here when dying. It sounds pretty good, to be honest. When enemies get hit, they splash with blood, which I think looks really smart. Of course, it's got a full screen of gameplay, but it does work and do the job just fine. It is a challenging game, although I managed to get further with this version compared to the Commodore 64's European Death Festival release. It's really responsive to control, and getting in the tanks give you a particular power where destruction is inevitable. Oddly enough, tanks are actually icons in this conversion rather than sprites, so to speak. It's a decent version and it's very colourful too, just a shame it wasn't presented with a whole vertical look, otherwise this likely could have ranked higher. One thing to note, it does tend to have some slowdowns, but it could be much worse like other versions we've seen. From janky versions of this game to other versions which didn't go for the arcade's vertical and centralized look, this Amiga's 1988 Elite release has it all. Is this a perfect arcade port though? Well, no, but having said that, pretty much every version of Ikari Warriors has its flaws, some worse than others. The Commodore Amiga's version, however, was actually fun to play. It operates at a fairly good speed, although it does drop in frames from time to time. Like I say, it's not perfect, but likely the best version to play if you didn't have the SNK arcade machine in your bedroom at the time, which was fairly unlikely. This was likely one of the best home conversions. Now, if you are one of those people who claims I am biased with placing Amiga in first place in the past few episodes, please watch my entire playlist of this series. Remember, this is the 50th episode. You will then see that this is far from the case. Amiga had some real trash in its day. The choice of colours used here are awesome. It's presented in probably the best ratio to the arcade game itself. For those versions which gave us an animated plane crashing introduction, most were fairly slow, almost struggling. The Amiga's version, on the other hand, seems to animate this at ease. Like I say, is it the best Amiga conversion ever? No, but certainly in my opinion, the best version of this game outside of the arcade game itself, and that's why I simply rank this one in first place. And that's it for today's ranking of various home conversions of Ikari Warriors. Let us know in the comments if you were unfortunate enough to be in America at the time and have that godforsaken Commodore 64 release. Or did you have a better release? Did you have it for, say, the Atari ST or even the Amstrad CPC version, which was equally pretty good? But anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. The Ninja Warriors released in arcades back in 1987 by Taito. It was a particularly special game in that, unlike many other arcades games, the Ninja Warriors had a triple widescreen. This was achieved by having the main display in between projected images of two other displays which were placed inside of the cabinet itself and used mirrors to reflect. And that's how, in a nutshell, that gave us the fairly unique widescreen and triple display, which by all accounts looked phenomenal back in its day. Of course, we had other games which also released in this year, which was 1987, such as Darius, which also used the same cabinet to achieve this widescreen effect. The game is a highly detailed one and is considered as a beat-em-up, although not the average beat-em-up, a merge between beat-em-up and perhaps run and gun. Sprites in the arcade game are finely detailed to a very high quality, and of course the main thing this game is known for is of course its music. It truly is one of the best, if not best, arcade tunes of all time, and likely worth playing for this alone. The aim of the game is fairly standard: attack oncoming enemies, which come in both directions from left to right, hit them down or throw shurikens which are limited. As you are attacked, you'll notice that your robot's disguise will slowly fall off and metal will begin to show, which looks really cool. The storyline is fairly generic of this era. In 1993, the American government have declared martial law, and so as an attempt to bring society back to normal, rebellious scientists create robots to take down soldiers. Like I say, that dystopian theme is a big part of many arcade games of the 80s. It's almost like in the 1980s, arcade game designers could predict the future far beyond 1993. So after many people asking for the Ninja Warriors, today we are comparing every home conversion of it and establishing which version is actually the best next to the arcade release. I will note that if you're expecting to see the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom version here, it won't be here. The SNES version is considered as a follow-up or sequel, and it's a very different game entirely. Virgin published the Amstrad CPC's version of the Ninja Warriors and released it in 1989. It has been coded using the Amstrad CPC 0 mode, which has given us the very bright colours and finer detail. Now, notably, the game is presented in an attempted widescreen ratio, which actually looks fairly good here. I will note that the introduction music of the arcade game sounds pretty good on the CPC too. The gameplay itself isn't that great. It is sluggish as the screen scrolls to the right, and did notice fairly bad slowdowns whilst too much was happening all at once on the screen. We do have the option to play this version with 2 people like most other versions here, although I didn't attempt this as I didn't want to crash the game. Now, most disappointingly is that we have no option for in-game music at all with this release. We have fairly average sound effects which are quite mediocre. I did notice something though that the arcade game didn't have so much of in stage 1, and that was soldier after soldier launching grenades at you every few seconds. Another thing to note with the Amstrad's version is that whenever we're being attacked, we don't actually see the robot become invisible and just remains as a human form. It is also slightly sluggish to control and doesn't appear to let the player attack whilst jumping here. And it goes without saying we also have no voice synth with this version either. The ZX Spectrum conversion is very much like the Amstrad's version, but obviously displayed in monochrome black and white. There are 2 versions of the Ninja Warriors for the ZX Spectrum, the 48K release and the 128K release. I tested the 128K release for this video, so we get a fairly decent version of the arcade's music at the start of the game, but sadly this disappears once the game actually starts. Considering this version was a 128K release, I naturally assumed it would have music in-game, but it didn't. Sound effects are actually here though. What makes this version a slight better than Amstrad's version is simply that the game runs so much better for the Spectrum. There are slowdowns, don't get me wrong, but nothing compared to the CPC's version. In fact, I am inclined to say that the CPC version was likely a port of this version, but upgraded in colour of course. Everything here, including no ability to attack whilst jumping, is similar to the Amstrad's game. It wasn't out of the ordinary for the Amstrad to get lazy ports like this. The game does scroll fairly well though, and I gotta say it's particularly hard because once we die whilst we're even on the boss parts of the game, we need to then restart the level, and that can be very frustrating. The Amiga's 1989 Virgin Masteronic release has a mixed bag of lovers and haters. Some say it's a bad conversion, some will say it's near arcade perfection. Now, although the game looks nice, there is some kind of bug with this release, I think. The game loads up with great sounding music, and I'll consider this as perfect in that respect. The issue is that in-game there is no music, just sound effects, and very nicely done voice synth too. So I researched online if this game came with music in-game, and it seems to be a very confusing story. There is another video on YouTube of this game where the game actually has music, but others have issues getting it to work. If we press the help button on keyboard on the Amiga, we can see that we can either use the options menu to turn it on or off by using the M key. I tried both and was still actually left with just sound effects. I tried several emulators for this, including Denise, and also used WHD load as well as a few different ADF versions, but we are still left with just sound effects. So as for the gameplay and presentation itself, the game doesn't look bad. I was particularly impressed with the detail of the robot you control and those animations of when it jumps and lands. The ponytail goes up and down, which reflects the up and down motion. The robotic walk is also here, which looks fairly close to the arcade game. The movements that emulate the arcade game are definitely here. I was actually surprised that this release didn't have parallel scrolling either. I did find though that collision detection actually wasn't that great with this version, but when it was working fine, hitting and killing enemies did have the staggering back effect rather than just instantly disappearing like the 8-bit versions mainly did. This version also opens up with the introduction in storyline 2. Now, this is very controversial ranking this C64 version over the Amigas, but this is the version I played as a kid. It's not a game that I played much of, but at the time, I thought the music was fantastic, and it still is really. One of my personal favourite SID tunes for sure. Thankfully, Random Access developed this game, and that's why we got a fairly decent version for the Commodore 64. Of course, it's not a groundbreaking version, but certainly is a decent enough 8-bit computer version. Something that this comes with is a fairly smooth game with no frame drops from what I've experienced. The backdrops are nicely done here and a slight above average for a C64 game from 1989. Something that did actually stand out in particular with this version is that we have two layers being used here. One that acts as the main walking area and another which acts as the sky behind the buildings. It actually looks very good for basic parallax scrolling, that is. Something I did appreciate with this port is that when we die, we get to continue from the same place. So of course, not arcade perfection by a long shot. For example, the robot isn't exposed when we get hit by enemies. There are no sound effects with this version either, although the music, as I say, is just awesome in this version. We do, however, have a nice widescreen effect with those large black borders above and below the gameplay area. It's nice to control, and we can even attack whilst jumping in this version. In comparison with the Amiga's version, I just felt that this was much smoother, easier to control, but like I say, a fairly controversial opinion there. We are moving on to another 16-bit home computer system now with the Atari ST's 1990 release. Although this conversion does suffer issues with not providing the best scrolling, in fact the Amiga's release had better score than this one. This version for one had music, which was easier to play and game with and easier to disable it too. We have nice widescreen presentation of the game and it just generally feels a little better in production value compared to the Amiga's version. It seems nicer to control and I think the sound effects here was actually better than the Amiga's offering too. Although I do say that the Amiga version had the best version of the music itself. The sounds of bullets being fired here with the Atari ST's port is actually amazing. The grenades exploding sounded pretty awesome too. The TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine 1989 Japanese release direct from Taito isn't a bad version at all. Firstly, you will notice that yes, the visual side of things aren't as good as say the Amiga's version, but we firstly get an options menu here where we can increase or decrease difficulty levels as well as incorporating a few other choices we can use, including who we get to play as in this game. Now this was fairly difficult ranking this version above everything else so far. At the end of the day, this was a decent version to play. Hit collision detection was pretty spot on here too, whereas some other versions wasn't as perfect. The music sounds pretty good here too, as well as the sound effects. Something which most other conversions didn't have was turning into a robot or losing that human look as we are getting shot and hit at. So considering those things, we do have something a little bit more faithful to the original arcades game. Of course, the backdrops aren't the best, they are kinda dull for a PC Engine game that is, but it does play really well, and can honestly say this was one of the most enjoyable versions to play outside of the arcades game itself. One annoying thing, however, was when dying, instead of continuing from the point of death, it was just another case of restarting the stage again. And in first place, I have decided to place the Japanese 1993 Sega Mega CD released by Taito Corporation. Firstly, this truly is likely the best version for the music and sound effects side of things with Ninja Warriors. Although you do lose your human look, which isn't perfect, as I went through the entirety of stage 1, I didn't find my robotics was exposing after being hit. I then moved on to stage 2 when it began to vanish, and so was then able to see myself as a robot, which looks pretty awesome here. We also have a fairly good options menu here too, which again, just like the TurboGrafx version, we can choose between difficulty levels, and a few other options are also added here too. The game is a big visual upgrade compared to the PC Engine's version, without a doubt. In terms of movement, how your robot is animated, it looks fairly faithful to what it is attempting to imitate. The colours on this release are slightly on the darker side and not as bright as the 1987 arcade game, but it's likely the best home conversion of the game in my opinion. Everything flows smoothly here and no frame drop issues either. We do have an introduction video to the game with this release too, and you can watch it by accessing it through the options menu rather than the game automatically playing it for you when you boot it up. It also comes with parallax scrolling. Of course, the fine intricate detail of the arcade game isn't really here, but neither does any other home conversion of this game. And that's it for ranking the various different home conversions of the Ninja Warriors today. Did you have the same version I did growing up, which was the Commodore 64 version? Which version of the Ninja Warriors would you have personally placed in number 1? Anyways, if you're new to this series, I'm going to leave the playlist for everything I've covered so far with arcade home conversions. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. When we think of classic arcade racing games from the 1980s, we often think about Outrun or even Chase HQ. Prior to these, Buggy Boy, or Speed Buggy as it's known in North America, came first in 1985 and was developed by Tatsumi. It was known for having one of the best arcade cabinets at the time, which was a cockpit cabinet which came with a panoramic 3-screen display which slightly surrounded you to give the player that more immersive racing experience. The game is not only extremely detailed and very colourful, but a real fun racer to play. It might be a fairly old game, but this one in particular has held up extremely well compared to racers that even came after Buggy Boy. The game is fairly simple. We can choose from several different race courses. The aim is to finish in the shortest possible time. Each race contains 5 legs, where the course gradually gets more tricky to race. The courses are full of flags and gates which offers points. We also have obstacles and can even have our buggy jump over logs. Like I was saying, for its time, which was 1985, this was a fairly advanced and very innovative racing game. It is also a very challenging game too, especially trying to make it across narrow bridges. Each course in the original arcade game looks great still. From snowy courses to desert courses and pure off-road challenges, we can even ride sideways in this game, and going under tunnels looks truly amazing. It is presented in an almost cartoon style, and it looks really great for it too. Kind of like it's not taking itself too seriously, but seriously at the same time. So by popular request and through going through your requests, we have finally arrived at going through each home conversion of this amazing racer and establishing which conversion was the best one next to the arcade game. Let's just say that this is no Chase HQ in terms of a great racer for the ZX Spectrum. I wouldn't go as far as saying it was as pitiful as the C64's version of Chase HQ though. I will be honest, from time to time, I will play particular versions of games for this series, which I seriously cannot wait to finish playing. This is definitely one of them. Where do I start with this monstrosity? There are several things wrong with Buggy Boy by Elite releasing in 1988 for the ZX Spectrum. Now, as terrible as this sounds, this is running the 128K Spectrum version, which technically should be fairly good. but it really isn't. The track is really difficult to see, as instead of clear lines of track which divides the track and outer track, all we get here is dashes, which looks more messy and confusing to know where we're going. Of course, the biggest disaster is the size of the buggy itself. I mean, really, what were they actually thinking? Combined with objects in the road such as rocks and a track you can't make much sense of, these three problems alone are enough to drive a man insane. Literally, the colours used are shocking, and this version doesn't even perform too great in terms of speed. It truly is horrendous. If I found this awful to play here in 2025, I am not sure what people in 1988 would have made of it. The ZX Spectrum was fully capable of powering fairly decent racers. Like I mentioned before, Chase HQ on the Spectrum was way up there as one of the best racers around for 8-bit computers at the time. Am I going to ever play this version again then? No. I would rather go and attempt to learn assembly language to create something better than this, even if it took me years to do so. Elite Systems released the Amstrad CPC conversion back in 1987. Honestly, considering many Amstrad games tend to be very sluggish and suffer from immense frame drops within arcade conversions I've tested in this arcade port series, I was actually really surprised to see how well this version of Buggy Boy actually performed. Sure, it comes in a smaller box ratio, and there is no attempt to make it wide either, but we can see it looks like it's made a really good attempt to convert a fairly complex arcade game for a mere 8-bit microcomputer. It's easy enough to control. Joystick up accelerates, joystick down decelerates, and fire button raises the gear to high or low. It performs superb. It picks up a good pace of speed with ease here. Sure, in terms of certain parts of the courses, the narrow bridges aren't narrow at all here, but just the same size as the roads we are actually racing on. The course selection screen was a little bland, but surprised me again when pressing fire button to select a course. We even had the arcade 8-bit rendition with stars rotating around the image playing that little tune. In terms of how the buggy is presented, we are slightly looking down from a higher point of view here, but it does the job well. Speed and depth perception is also here. It looks much like you are racing. Objects on the side of the roads are missing here, and the distant image of mountains are a little blocky too. Jumping over logs looks really good, and there is even a separate sprite used here for going on two wheels. This is a very good conversion, and I would imagine it was one of the best arcade conversions for the CPC. The Commodore 64 also got a very good version and definitely above average for a C64 racing game. In Commodore 64 fashion, the colours are dull in comparison to the Amstrad's conversion, but this version was just a tad better to play. It seemed, although there were more bends in the road, and those narrow bridges even existed here, which offers that little more challenge inside of the game. We also got a full gameplay screen with this 1987 Elite release. Again, although not arcade perfection in terms of how it looks, it certainly does play well. The buggy seems much more flexible when turning and making jumps, just seems a little more movable with this version. Some might argue that it looks way too blocky compared to the Amstrad's version, and that's very true, it does. But of course, this isn't an official ranking video, it's just my humble opinions after all. The difficulty level was particularly high with this release. Some have even said it is better than the original arcade game. The 3D effect here is also really nicely done, where speed and depth perception is nicely done too. Sound effects are as likely as close to the arcade game as they can get for an 8-bit computer. Again, just like the CPC's version, this version for the Commodore 64 is way up there and ranks as one of the best racers for the system. It also has a very nice course selection screen where stars circle the course box when chosen. I particularly liked the 3D effect when racing under tunnels here. A really nice conversion which very likely kept kids in 1987 very happy for a little while. Now that we have arrived to the systems much more capable, nitpicking needs a little more refinement here. So we will start off with the Atari ST's conversion. Now, firstly and evidently, a major upgrade from the previous versions in this video in terms of visuals, that is. So we will start off with the sky. The arcades game features a couple of courses which are using gradient colors, which represents the sky. The off-road course, for example, had a gradient color of light blue, which then merges into orange. On the ST conversion here, we have a solid orange. The shades of orange do change as we go through the course though, which is representing time changes. In looking at the Buggy itself, the arcades game contains several different sprites for when turning left to right. The Atari ST version is fairly basic when turning. You don't get to see much of the sights when turning corners. We also have minimal animations too when landing after jumping off logs. The arcade game shows a little more dimension to the Buggy, whereas with the ST conversion there are just a couple of sprites used to represent this. So now on with the good. Undoubtedly this is a decent ST game. It does control fairly well and operates at a steady pace, although it does appear to play at a frame rate which could be much better, of course. We don't get the arcade look when choosing a course. The arcade game has each course inside of a box represented by image of it, but every home conversion receives didn't get this anyways. The tracks are well designed, the narrow bridges are awkward to cross just like the original game was. We also have some objects on the sides of the roads or dirt track we are racing on. One thing with the Atari ST version that beats anything in this list is the actual sound effects when racing into flags and gates, which are actually the closest to the arcade game as you will get. It's, like I say, a decent enough racer for the Atari ST, and likely one of the best on the platform too, but the next version just gives it that little more. And in first place, in my opinion, the Amiga's version pretty much looks similar to the Atari ST's version, although this Amiga game is much more speedier and runs at smoother pace too. Now, there are people out there which will argue the Commodore 64 conversion is better than this, which of course is down to debate, but obviously the Amiga's version has the full arcade look. Sure, it's not presented in that widescreen look, very simply because this was produced in 1988 by Elite. It was more than likely that having a widescreen look on a 4:3 ratio monitor was going to take away much of the gameplay screen, and obviously would have been left with boring black borders. Besides, widescreen TVs didn't really make it on a full-scale commercial basis until the 90s and early 2000s. So yes, I found this version much more responsive when handling turns from left to right. The Buggy just seemed much more flexible when controlling in general compared to the Atari ST's port. Sure, the sound effects are different from the arcade's release, and it's obvious that the ST won with that battle. One thing that the ST nor the Amiga actually did was have that very high-pitched sound of the Buggy itself, so both fairly equal in that respect. Like I said, putting these 16-bit computer conversions together are almost identical, but the Amiga wins really on the basis of having that little extra oomph, and Woodson felt a little more smoother to play too. A very close call for sure with these two systems. And that's it for ranking the various home conversions of Buggy Boy or Speed Buggy today. So which version did you have growing up? Did you have that terrible, absolutely terrible monstrosity of a ZX Spectrum port? Or was you happy enough with your Atari ST or Amiga conversion? Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.
Let's go!
I have always thought a Smash TV is a bit of a Running Man ripoff when it comes to the storyline. In fact, the storyline's theme for this game was actually borrowed from both RoboCop and The Running Man, which both happen to be two of the 80s most violent films, and also two of my personal favourites. The plot of the game is fairly simple. Of course, it is set in a dystopian future of 1999, which when this game released for arcades back in 1990, the year 1999 seemed fairly far off. A celebrity known as the Master of Ceremonies, or just MC for short, hosts the game Smash TV, which is the year 1999's most popular form of entertainment on TV. We play as contestants on Smash TV who need to take down waves of enemies by any means necessary in order to make it to subsequent rooms in order to progress to take on challenging bosses whilst picking up prizes along the way. And that is it. MC gives us a chance to get prizes like VCRs and wads of cash. All we need to do is just survive. So very similar to the Running Man in terms of fighting for freedom. A simple game to navigate. We take down waves of enemies and move to the next room. If we collect certain items, we can even enter what is known as a pleasure dome. We also sometimes get to choose which way to go. MC will make an appearance throughout the game with voice synth quoting things from Robocops. Each room can be fairly easy to an absolute nightmare in difficulty levels, with literally hordes of enemies to shoot down who will crowd around you. We have many different weapons in the game to pick up, from an instant blow up everything on screen to grenade launchers. The game is considered as a dual twin shooter and was of course a big inspiration for the awesome 2019 Xenocrisis game. So today we are ranking from worst to best, which I consider as the very best home conversion of the Williams Electronic 1990 release of Smash TV. Ocean released the Amstrad CPC conversion in 1991 and was developed by Acclaim. Of course, Ocean as well as Acclaim games could be hit or miss, but what we have here for the Amstrad is a fairly good attempt at Smash TV. Yes, it is extremely cut down, we get no introduction screen and see no studio cameras or lighting from ceilings. We get no frequent pop-ups from MC with women behind him holding cash. We get new enemies to fight here too, including some cut down sprites from the original arcade game. Walking between rooms is just another black screen rather than seeing small pathways to each new room like the arcade game had. It goes without saying there is nowhere near as many enemies on screen all at once like we are used to seeing originally, but for what it is, the CPC version is really good and fairly addictive too. What I admire about this conversion is the pure speed of it and its consistent frame rate rather than dropping when too much is happening. The controls aren't like the arcade twin shooter experience and just require us walking around and aiming a weapon in the correct direction we want to shoot in. I was really surprised with how good this Amstrad game was. Again, I was very surprised of how well the ZX Spectrum conversion of Smash TV works for the 128K models. Sprites in different enemies, like the CPC version, were almost the same here. What I thought was a bit of an upgrade with this version was that we had at least an opening scene to the game with the studio part, which made it seem just a little more like the game it is attempting to emulate. Again, this is one speedy conversion and definitely a tough one too. It has plenty of colours, sure it looks rudimentary, but it plays fairly well. Weapons with this version seem a little more satisfying to use, such as a triple shotgun. The game even opens up with a controlling screen, which is presented in a Smash TV style. Text above the gameplay screen, which tells us the scores and lives, are also done with a scanline looking effect to give us the vibe of a TV screen we're looking at. The gameplay areas are also a little better in terms of design too. This is a cracking ZX Spectrum game that released in 1991 by Ocean. The Sega Game Gear received a conversion in 1994 by Flying Edge. It is pretty much the same game as the next version in this list, but only choppier to play. So we do have music within the game itself for this 1992 Flying Edge release of Smash TV for the Sega Master System, and the game looks fairly good, complete with fairly impressive opening presentation of the studio, but I just really felt that this game was majorly let down by its bizarre control scheme, and it was fairly ugly to look at and had very janky sprites. We have an option menu with the Sega Master System version to change the controller layout. I tried different options but was pretty much all the same. For a Sega Master System game, this was quite a letdown if I'm honest. Sprites, or as some will call them, is tiles, move janky. I often felt that sometimes when shooting at enemies, the buttons wasn't responding. So I looked back at early reviews of the game, and it was even known for the time. For a very basic 8-bit console game, this could have been very good, but it wasn't for a couple of controller issues. We didn't even get segments between rooms where we see contenders walking through the corridors. Like I said, with the Sega Game Gear release, both are pretty much the same, only this Master System version appeared to be a little more responsive. Now, this is how to do an 8-bit computer conversion. Smash TV on the Commodore 64 is way up there. It's been one of the best ports on this platform. Of course, it's very noticeable that we just have black on the floor areas, but really, that's likely my only complaint with this version. The pace of this version is just ample, and controlling the contestants feels a little more like there is some weight rather than flying around everywhere like the Amstrad and Spectrum's versions. We even get a map pop-up too here to give us an overall arcade feel. The enemy sprites are largely looking like the arcade game too, without the need of adding extra ones. Each arena we enter gives us a nice flashy display. Using weapons feels really good here, especially using the protective barrier where bouncing the enemies with it kills them, and it looks good. The wads of cash in wrapped up prizes also look so similar to the arcade game itself. I took on Mutoid Man, the first boss, and I was really surprised by how faithful this was. Sure, there are no voice samples from what I've heard, but everything just looks so good here. To the point that when Mutoid Man makes the room shakes and it looks like it used sports to do this. To make it even more faithful, the score system is even on the gameplay area too. This seriously is a great game and a highly addictive one too for the Commodore 64. I was blown away by how good this acclaimed 1992 NES release actually was. Historically, Nintendo didn't like to associate itself with violence in games, although they did produce games such as Robocop where these were generally watered down. So we have Smash TV for the epic 8-bit console. This is a great conversion. It opens up promising, complete with voice samples which sound almost identical to the arcade game, with MC popping up before stages begin. The quality of those pop-ups where MC and the women behind him are really nicely detailed and full of colour. The sprites in this version are scaled down in size compared to others, but it does the job, and you can certainly see that we are playing Smash TV. We have the scoreboard on the gameplay area. We even have maps that appear after rooms are complete. Barely any sprite flicker, which is quite impressive for a NES game with so much happening on the screen all in one go. And it also operates at a fair pace of speed too. The controls are tight here, although they are basic with pointing the weapon in the same direction to shoot. It works perfectly, and the Master System counterpart of this was truly shocking in comparison with its controls. The music sadly doesn't last throughout the game. It fades out and brings in sound effects, but the music truly is superb here. And we even get the corridor scenes in between stages. Yes, I was very happy playing this one. Very cool stuff.
Good luck. You all need it.
Next up, we got the Atari ST version. So firstly, there's no music in the game itself, slightly slower than the next release in this video. Sound effects with the Atari ST release is okay, but nothing really spectacular, although the introduction music is admittedly pretty good here. We do get a walk into the studio scene here, and other faithful visuals such as maps popping up, but walk into subsequent rooms through corridors don't give us this. It's just a black screen, followed with the logo of Smash TV. There is no voice samples in this version. It is very similar to the next version, which just runs that much better and sounds better. Now, the Amiga conversion tends to be debated. Some will find it bad, some will find it really good. Personally, I thought this 1991 Ocean release tended to be fairly good. Of course, it could have been much better, but still, we are ranking what I consider to be the best. So firstly, there is no in-game music at all, and there is no cutscenes in between stages, or even studio introduction, but something it does have going for it is that sprites are looking almost like the arcade game itself. The screen can also get horrendously overwhelmed very quickly with enemy waves coming from all directions. Despite a couple of cutbacks, I just felt this version was a step in the right direction for the gameplay alone. There is very little frame rate issues here with this Amiga release, although a very tough version of Smash TV. The arcade game itself was no walk in the park, was it? Wads of cash and wrapped up prizes look really nice here too. Just like most versions in this list, it also offers a simultaneous 2-player game. Generally, the gameplay layout is the same as the arcade game itself, with the scoreboards on the gameplay areas. It's just a real shame that a little more effort didn't go into this, such as adding a studio introduction and cutscenes in between stages. One thing that really stood out is being blown up, a nice animation of an eyeball flying into the air. Very awesome stuff. The Sega Mega Drive's turn for Smash TV came in 1992 and released by Flying Edge. This was an outstanding version and a big upgrade from the 16-bit computers that had it ported. Everything is pretty much here, including a great opening to the game, and as we move between rooms to fight hordes of enemy waves, the studio cameras and scaffolding follows us like it is in the arcade, using parallax scorn effect to make it look 3D, and it's done really well here too. Controls for the Sega Mega Drive version are some of the best I have played for this game, and we can even change controller mappings inside of the options menu. Of course, having more action buttons for a game like Smash TV was always going to be beneficial. The opening to the game looks very authentic, with MC waving his arms about, using voice samples, saying "Total Carnage." It's a fairly colourful game too. The depth of the gameplay areas look well, with some nice shadowing added to give it that top-down treatment. It's certainly one of the most tougher releases, but it just plays so well. Hit collision detection is great, the waves of enemies are fairly similar to the arcade game, and they are consistent too. Once a wave is gone, another wave will arrive very soon after. Mutoid Man is also designed well too. As we start destroying it, his body starts flying apart. Very bizarre, just like the arcade game had. This is a great game which also comes with very faithful music throughout with great sound effects added. And finally, in first place, I have decided to go for Super Smash TV. This is truly the next best version you would have had outside of the 1990 arcade game itself. Now, this 1992 Acclaim release did everything the Mega Drive version had, but made it 100 times much better. We get a ridiculous amount of voice samples here, both music and sound effects exist during gameplay, but the music is just an afterthought when we are shooting and blowing things up, much like the arcade game that is. The sound effects are truly amazing with this SNES conversion. We have literally got it all here, including having animations for being electrocuted, a really nice animation for when we are hit over. What makes this even better is that you can hear the audience cheer when you are hit over too. The music itself, in my opinion, is an absolute improvement for the original arcade game itself. It sounds incredible. Shading to represent a top-down view is here, and also the studio beams for cameras and lighting can also be seen as we travel to the first round. The pace and speed of this game is also very comparable with the arcade original. Really, if you had this back in 1992, you was likely having a great time with this game. Where many control layouts in each version was fairly poor to just okay or average, the SNES control pad, of course, had 4 action buttons. This game utilises each one as a directional shooting button, and it works so damn good too here. And that's it for ranking all the various different versions of Smash TV. If I've missed out a conversion, I truly apologise, but I hope to think I've got all the main ones here. Which version of Smash TV did you own back in the day? Do you remember playing Smash TV in the arcade like I do? Anyways, drop us a comment as always and let's hear your feedback. Do you agree that the SNES version was better than the Mega Drive version? Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. very strange name for a run-and-gun game from 1988 by Williams Electronics, and it certainly isn't a game named after your ex who enjoys turning your own family against you or anything like that. NARC is one of those most earliest examples of using extreme violence in a game that caused panic amongst parents back in the day. The premise of the game is to take down an underground network of drug traffickers and terrorists as ordered from the narcotics chairman at Washington DC. It is originally a 2-player simultaneous game where we get to play as either Max Force or the Hitman. Throughout the game we get to take down drug users and kingpins, we can shoot them or arrest them. There is plenty of pixelated gore and limbs flying everywhere with this game, especially when using rocket launchers to blow up gangs of enemies. Like I say, a fairly extreme game for a 1988 release, so forget Grand Theft Auto or even Doom, this game did all that first. It's a seriously fun game to play and an early example of using digitized images to give sprites that in-game realism look. I don't think it can be argued, but for a 1988 release, NARC looks incredibly sharp and detailed for its time. If you remember the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film, NARC was actually being played in the background of the Foot Clan's Hangout arcade. I will note here that the 2005 releases of NARC on both the original Xbox and PlayStation 2 will not be here, as these are totally different games and also sequels. And we are ranking which original home conversions was the next best thing to the 1988 arcade game itself. I'm also going to say here that all conversions minus one are fairly bad and laughable.
You're busted.
For kids loading the Amstrad CPC's conversion back in 1990, you likely would have enjoyed the opening presentation and fairly decent 8-bit music for the game. Sadly, most people playing the game for the Amstrad CPC at the time likely would have presumed that loading went wrong when there was no in-game sound. If this annoyed you more, then the blocky sprites likely would have calmed you down, and that very slow-paced scrolling action too. As I was playing this version, I actually thought better than the fire a missile, as a poor thing was struggling enough as it was, and I simply didn't want to overload things even further. Some people might moan about Amstrad CPC games getting the worst conversions. I'd say look at it for what it is and not out of nostalgia. This really is a terrible conversion of NARC. It's not entertaining, it's slow, depressing, and overly really bad to control. The ZX Spectrum 128K received a conversion from Ocean in 1990. Now, because playing NARC had several actions that were a little different to simulate on a standard one action button joystick, we had to use the keyboard to make some of the actions work alongside the joystick, which was a common theme with particular games on the micros. For example, we had to use spacebar to make our character jump, which is a real pain. In order to fire missiles, you held onto the fire button for a couple of seconds and let go for this to take effect. So as for the gameplay itself, we get an introduction for missions where we see who the enemy is, and it looks fairly good here. The presentation looks fairly faithful given its limitations. We don't arrive at stages by car, we are just plopped onto the stage and the action starts. There is no in-game music, just rudimentary sound effects which aren't that bad to be honest. In terms of frame rates, it does certainly slow down a fair amount on the old Specky when a lot happens at once. And to be fair, the original game had a lot happening, but it wasn't being powered by a ZX Spectrum of course. Likely it was just a case of cutting down in-game action and taking away sprites, which would actually have made the game fairly boring to play, or just add lots and kids would just have to deal with it. Colour wise, we had the typical Spectrum monochrome look, but if you're a Spectrum fan, this would have meant nothing to you anyways. The gameplay is what matters, and the gameplay here is actually pretty good regardless of slowdowns. Out of all 8-bit computers that NARC was released on, I was kind of hoping at this point at least the Commodore 64 could do the best job. Sure, out of Amstrad and Spectrum's attempts, this was slightly better in that we have in-game music, which sounds pretty good here, and we have a decent and consistent speed that the game is running at. But really, that is where I will stop the highlights of the Ocean 1990 release for the C64. The sprites themselves look ridiculously chunky and very dull in colour too. Enemies in particular stand out big time. It's almost reminded me of that awful Ikari Warriors C64 version, which I previously covered in this series in terms of enemy sprites looking so bad, to the point where they look really stretched. The game hasn't got parallax scrolling, with city buildings in the background having another layer to simulate that 3D effect like the arcade game. I'd say that game is below average at best. The gameplay itself plays fairly well, it is smooth and our character moves nicely. One thing that didn't particularly look good was launching missiles. There wasn't much emphasis on exploding limbs. In fact, it was reduced to mainly a few explosion sprites to cover up the exploding limbs. Although oddly enough, attention was given to bullets having shadows as they shoot across the screen. If you thought the sprites themselves were over pixelated here, the helicopter which flies through stage 2 and your car in stage 3 was just too much to handle. Like I say, out of all 3 8-bit home conversions for microcomputers, I'd say this was the best option, but by no means does it look good. It is purely based on how well this version ran in comparison with the other 2 computer versions. Now, I was expecting the Atari ST conversion to be fairly good. What I didn't expect was to have NARC looking so dark. I have watched many video gameplays of this version, and it really was a case of either adjusting the brightness on your screen, or this is what we get, a dark gameplay screen where it can be difficult to see what is going on. It's a great shame as the gameplay itself and different sprites used for walking upwards and downwards are actually here. The HUD's layout is also very similar to the arcades game, and the sound effects are pretty good here too, although there isn't any background music in game. The opening music is very good here though. It is missing the iconic stage openings with the speeding car entering into the stages. I got to say that out of most versions of NARC, the ST version is particularly difficult. Just like I was hoping that Commodore 64 would have a really good version for the 8-bit computer versions, I was hoping the same for Amiga, but all I can say is that this is pretty much the same as the Atari ST conversion, only slightly faster with frame rates and more brightly coloured, although this is no doubt a dark game for the Amiga too. The Amiga in ST ports had something in common, those damn dogs who chase after you and having to click the joystick down twice very quickly to duck and shoot them. It's very annoying. Again, this version opens up with the same music as ST's port, just a slight upgrade, and like I say, generally the same game. It could have been so much better for the Amiga, but this is what Ocean gave us in this 1990 release. No cool arrival to stages by car, and incredibly and unnecessarily difficult to play from the get-go. And in first place, the Nintendo Entertainment System had a version of NARC, which is very strange for the NES considering the theme and storyline of the game itself. You know what, this isn't a bad port at all. Sprites, including the car, all look fairly good here, even if they kind of do look a little scaled down in size. We also have a separate sprite for when our character is walking up and down so we can see the front and back of him, like the arcade game. We have both in-game music as well as sound effects, which all sounds very good too. I wasn't expecting to see bags of white stuff or certainly enemies' limbs flying everywhere as I launch missiles at them. In terms of colour, looks very good to me. Obviously, we don't have the whole digitized imagery, which made the arcades game look so good in its day. After all, this is an 8-bit console, which happens to do everything fairly well. We have alternative text being displayed on shops, which aren't so blatant with the rawness of the arcade original. We even have the helicopter here in stage 2, which opens fire on you and drop bombs on you. Acclaim released this version in 1990. It scrolls nicely and is really nice to control too. Out of most versions, I didn't honestly expect the NES version to be this good, but it really was. What also makes this version a little better is that, of course, we had 2 action buttons on the Nintendo NES controller, and so the need of using a keyboard for certain actions wasn't needed here. So that's it. I did warn you at the get-go of this video today that there was some horrendous versions of NARC for your home computers, and oddly enough, the NES version just seemed to be that much better. So which version did you have? Was you very disappointed that your Atari ST's version was so dark? Which version did you play? And most importantly, do you remember playing this in the arcade? What a fantastic game. Anyways, if you're new to the channel and you want to catch up with my arcade ports ranking series, I'll leave the playlist in the description so you can watch over 50 videos at this point. Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching. It's not too often that I upload an arcade ports video where each conversion for each system is fairly decent, but here we are with several different platforms that Flying Shark, or Sky Shark as it is known in North America, is actually the case. I will say now that there really wasn't an extraordinarily bad version of this game at all. This 1987 Taito Arcade's vertical scroll shoot-em-up is a notoriously difficult game. If the arcade vendors decided to give kids a break by adjusting the dip switch to an easier difficulty level, then you might have gotten somewhere back in the day with this game. But its default setting is likely one of the arcade's most challenging games of this kind. The original arcades game doesn't pander around after you. The developers made sure that when enemy bullets are heading your way, they travel a hell of a lot faster than you can to avoid them, which can be a nightmare when several bullets are aiming to hit you from various directions. It's one of those games that it's best remembering where enemies and their weight patterns are. Generally, when I am playing a shoot 'em up, they are a no-brainer. Some are of course tougher than others, but normally I can literally fly through the stages. Flying Shark isn't like this. To make it even more challenging, when we do die, instead of respawning at the same point, we are taken back to a checkpoint. So if you have just made it through the toughest part by fluke and you get destroyed seconds after, you have then got to attempt that fluke again. Weapon upgrades stay at a complete minimal with this game, and it is all very strategically done, so kids would obviously waste as much money as possible. Many of you were requested this one from me, so today we are ranking from worst to best, the best and closest home conversion of Flying Shark. And let me just remind you, I was stressed playing most of these versions. So first up, the ZX Spectrum conversion by Firebirds, which released back in 1987, was the first port of Flying Shark that I played. I found it amazingly easy to play in comparison with the arcades game, which is notoriously difficult. It was either a case that the Spectrum version was not actually this easy, or it was where I was used to playing it at a much higher challenge with the arcade version, where I was being shot down literally every 40 to 50 seconds. So roughly the first stage layout is almost the same as the source material. Obviously typical Spectrum monochrome colours is fine, because the gameplay here really makes up for that entirely. It is a good, smooth and nice game to play with highly responsive controls. By holding down on fire button releases bombs, I actually thought that the explosion effect here was really nicely done. It's just a simple flash but looks good. Obviously in the arcades game the explosions are much different, but the same memory. I guess the programmers for this version improvise this. Attack patterns of enemies are almost the same as the arcades game too. I was really surprised of how well this game actually played, but I did however noticed when gaining firepower upgrades by shooting, this would slightly cause minor frame drops to the gameplay. There was also no taking off from the hangar sequence at the start of stage 1, but rather just plopped us into the first stage. Overall, a decent and solid conversion of Flying Shark for the Spectrum 48K models. Now, although Amstrad games generally run slower than, say, Spectrum games, I actually found Flying Shark for the CPC better to play for this. It ran just a touch slower, but felt a little more like the arcades game, where it isn't a drastically fast game. It took my eyes adjusting to this version as the colours on stage 1 are orange, green and black. It was a little tough initially as enemy bullets are actually green, and these colours do tend to clash with the floor area of the game, such as the tree parts. But I soon learned to bypass this and enjoy this game for what it was. As long as you watch enemies like a hawk, that is, you will be fine. In comparison to, say, the Spectrum version, we also have a humming sound coming from the biplane you are controlling, which adds a little more depth to it. The layout is pretty much the same as the arcades version, with no major changes from stage 1 at least, from what I've seen. It's fairly simple and easy to control. It has its own twist on explosions too, when using bombs that is. Sprites are fairly detailed here for an 8-bit computer port. I would also say that the sound effects used are much better than the Spectrum's version too. We get no emerging from the hangar sequence, but overall a really good 8-bit computer version of Flying Shark, and likely one of the Amstrad CPC's better vertical scrollers, which released in 1988 by Firebird using Mode 1. Commodore Amiga got a version of Flying Shark in 1988, also by Firebird. I was very disappointed with the performance and visuals with this game. Firstly, I felt that sprites were a little bigger than most versions, and there wasn't much maneuver room in the gameplay area to avoid things hitting you. And of course, providing this version with a long vertical ratio look of the game wasn't actually done here. It wasn't an easy game to play because of these things, and when enemies are firing at you, bullet sizes just seemed way too big, which added to the difficulty level. It does show obvious raindrops, and these do tend to dip more as the screen gets busier with multiple sprites. In terms of colour, it's average, nothing really to boast about here. The music and sound effects here are also average. There's a hell of a lot better on the Commodore Amiga with vertical scrolling shoot 'em ups. The IBM PC compatible version is known as Sky Shark in North America. This conversion released in 1989 by Taito themselves. By adjusting DOSBox to accurately get the correct speeds of how this game was originally intended to play, this is a very good version and certainly a good DOS game of this era too. It runs surprisingly really smoothly, contains some really good and faithful music as it attempts to port across the same music, and some impressive sound effects here too. I particularly like the sound effects used for hitting enemy vehicles. It gives a ping sound like metal hitting metal. Controlling the plane itself is a little different to other versions. It feels a little strange at first, and then it makes sense. To simulate the aircraft turning, it takes a nanosecond to actually move left or right rather than instantly doing it. If you have played this version, you'll know what I mean, but it is actually good to control once you get used to it. Dropping bombs is very good in an attempt to emulate the arcade look too. It runs at a fairly medium pace, maybe a tad slow, but definitely playable and enjoyable too. We also had the added ability here to change difficulty settings. After playing the Commodore 64 version, which I played before this version, it just seemed very relaxed in comparison. The colours in particular looked good here too, especially the treetops in their shadows beneath them to give them the whole 3D effect. Hit collision detection is top notch here too. Yes, this DOS version really surprised me with how well it looked and played. Next up, we got the Commodore 64's version. Now, I don't think there is no denying that the C64 did the best with the 8-bit computer versions of Flying Shark. We had the joy of both music and sound effects with this release. We also have a full sequence of flying out the hangar, which is a nice little touch to give that more arcade look. Releasing bombs is also more faithful to the arcades game than the other two 8-bit computer versions. Unfortunately, this version also has arcade's difficulty level too. After playing the Spectrum and Amstrad versions first, I generally thought this version would be similar. No, it really wasn't, and I died several times getting through the first stage. So standout features here with the C64 releases, clearly we have more than just a few colours being used to represent the gameplay world. Sprites, although admittedly a little blocky, do the job complete with accompanying shadows which cast on the floor beneath biplanes and enemy planes. Now, flying through water segments or the sea are nicely done here too. The other 8-bit computer versions didn't really show there was water below us, as well as this version did. Again, it is another version that controls really well, and hit collision detection is pretty spot on too. Barely any frame drops here either. It's a really good conversion, although a little on the tougher side admittedly. Although the game isn't centralized and as long as narrow as the other two 8-bit computer versions, it really does the job well here. Taito released the Nintendo Entertainment System version in 1989. Although it is scaled down in size, it does the game justice, where there is so much more room to maneuver on screen when we seriously need it most of the time. Now, this was a fairly hard choice placed in this version, as although there are better looking versions of the game in this video, this one felt much more arcade-like to play. The controls are pretty responsive too, and of course, the Nintendo Entertainment System, having two action buttons, made dropping bombs easier rather than holding onto a fire button and letting go like most computer versions had. It sounds fairly well with great sound effects, and was even surprised that the typical sprite flicker situation with most NES games didn't happen too much with this version of the game. The game also moves fluidly with very fast sprites. Controlling the biplane is speedier than most other versions too. I really enjoyed my time with Flying Shark on the Atari ST. Sure, it does slow down a touch when many things are happening at once, but it handles it really well and doesn't significantly deflect from this awesome Firebird's 1988 release. It has a really nice soundtrack to the game with sound effects added too. It is an upgrade in visuals from say the DOS conversion. This is much more detailed and refined with intricate details on the sprites. Dropping bombs is again attempting to give off that arcade swirling look, but doesn't pull it off too well if I'm honest. It certainly handles well, and the overall presentation of stage 1 opening up looks really good here. Its choice of colour palette is fairly good here too, not too bright and not too dull. Going back to intricate details and sprites, when we shoot at gun turrets, cracks appear as you're halfway of destroying them. It's a really simple but effective touch to give a little more realism to the game. Tank sprites are also nicely detailed with a few colours on top of them to signify the region you are fighting in or their battalion. I won't lie, this is one tough version of Flying Shark. It's definitely on the difficult side for sure. Enemy attack wave patterns are nice and smooth here too as they circle around you. It's a really impressive ST vertical shooter, likely one of the best on the platform. Now, for those of you who already know the different versions of this game, you would likely assume that the Shark X68000's Kenko 1991 release would win this, but honestly, I don't think it was as perfect as some other X68000's arcade conversions. Firstly, this version looks a little dull in colours in comparison to the winning release of the game in this video. Secondly, this version does in fact slow down when too much is happening on the screen at the same time. I also found the sprites to be a little bit too big compared with the winning version of the game I chose, and sometimes this makes it a little bit too difficult to avoid bullets where your biplane is so large. We also don't get the centralized vertical look here either. Now push those aside, it's a decent enough version of the game, but I have something in first place that's just that tiny little bit better. Ving released the FM Towns conversion back in 1993. This is in some ways feels like an updated version of Flying Shark, as it did release 6 years after the arcades game. The sound quality is obviously superior than most other ports, and the sound effects too. Just like several other versions, this is absolutely no exception of difficulty levels. This is extremely tough. Now, with most FM Town games, including this one, we do have an options menu for several things. One of them including difficulty settings. I obviously set this to easy, and this was extremely difficult. I wouldn't like to imagine what the hardest mode was on this game. I honestly didn't bother trying either. I am getting older now, and I need to keep an eye on my blood pressure. This type of stress isn't good for older people. What's best about this FM Towns release is that we even get a resolution option here too. We have a choice of low and high res. This is being played with the high res option. I am pretty sure many will argue with this version winning over the Sharp X68000 release, but if you play them and compare them both, you will see exactly what I mean here. And that's it for today's video and ranking every home conversion of the awfully, terribly difficult game, which is Flying Shark. Which version did you have? Did you have the easier version on the ZX Spectrum or even the Amstrad CPC? Which version would you have put in first place? Do you agree with me for those of you who's actually played between the Sharp and the FM Towns versions? Which one would you have actually personally put in first place? Anyways, thanks for everyone that suggested this video, and I'll say again, this has been absolute hell playing these games. Very tough game, and it's a game I'm likely never going to go back to. But anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. I am pretty confident that most Shinobi fans would likely say, although Shadow Dancer isn't a patch on the original game, it's still a good game. If by the chance you have never heard of Shadow Dancer, then it's a sequel to Shinobi which released 2 years afterwards, again released by Sega in 1989. So Shadow Dancer is a platforming hack and slash game where in this sequel to Shinobi, we are accompanied with a K9 which attacks enemies for us. If they pose a threat, we set the K9 on them and then we can take them down. The main weapon in this game is of course a shuriken, and up close to enemies we can hit them down with a sword. Both of these weapons are unlimited, although we do have magic to use too, which we can use 3 times. The aim of the game is to get through each level through defusing time bombs. The control mechanics are the same as Shinobi and virtually controls the same too, only with the addition of having the dog here, in which we can use by crouching down and hit an attack button. There are 4 different missions in this game, each comprising of a few levels. The final level in each stage contains a boss. As like any successful arcades game, we of course have many home conversions. So today we are checking out and ranking from worst to best which home conversion is the next best thing to Sega's 1989 arcade classic Shadow Dancer. I'm going to add just here, the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis version isn't the same game as the arcade release, although some people will likely ask this anyways. Let's see who has made it to this part of the intro. I will also warn you here that every version minus just one was released by US Gold. You heard it, US Gold. Shadow Dancer, The Secret of Shinobi for the Sega Master System is a strange one. It was a European power release only, which was a direct arcade port, but randomly added The Secret of Shinobi to the title, which is the same title and even the box art that the Mega Drive and Sega Genesis got too. The strange thing is that they are both very different games. The 16-bit Mega Drive release is actually a totally different game altogether, in fact. So what can I say about Shadow Dancer for the Master System? Well, all I will say is that it is certainly miles better than Cyber Shinobi, but not much really. Is it great? Well, not really. Firstly then, we have no K9 at all here, as you can see in the gameplay. You're going this alone. The moment we start level 1, we are bombarded with 5 enemies who throws knives at us, and these are very quick too. Now, I did notice that on a few occasions, these actually went through me, so hit collision detection is pretty way off here. Secondly, we have randomly got fires on the floor, which you need to jump over. Thirdly, we seem to have alien invasion going on with this version too. Enemies' heads are green. I really have no idea what this was about. Finally, one of the most irritating things above everything is not being able to scroll back at all. So if you happens to miss a bomb, you physically cannot go back to get it. You scroll one way and one way only. After the first level, we should then go straight to level 2, which is of course outside of the airport. Not here though, we immediately go straight to the boss, in which there is so little manoeuvre room to avoid his projectiles, that defeating him is ridiculously hard as it is so crammed. Really, I just gave up here and moved on. Just remember, this was nowhere near as terrible as the Cyber Shinobi, so at least this game does have that. As we play the Commodore 64 release, we open the game with a pitiful sound of very slow footsteps tapping away as we walk through the airport. Shinobi is looking particularly strange here. A very small and very slim looking sprite with a K9 that looks like he could do with some feeding. Now, firstly, we do have some fairly average parallax scoring for the outside scenery of the airport, which looks okay. I mean, for this era, graphics used here aren't that bad. There is no image for a plane at all outside though. Literally, just as we exit the first level, we see a very small airplane, which is quite pitiful. It's the gameplay and actions of enemies which are the big issue here. We get no health bar, and once we are hit, we have to start right back at the beginning of the level again, pretty much for most of the versions here. This can be a serious annoyance. This version of Shadow Dancer is so slow that walking through the same level over and over again just gets very tedious, very quickly too. We have no music here, and the sound effects sound like sound effects used from the early 1980s Commodore 64 game, rather than something being released in 1991. Going back to the visual side of things, we don't get a map with this release either, although we do get a fairly decent opening with the HUD slide across the screen. So we start level 2 with what looks like a Concorde in the background, and literally 2 seconds in, a very annoying enemy comes right behind us. There is no jumping to higher point here, where in the arcades game we jump on cargo containers, and we exit the stage on a conveyor belt rather than the stairs leading to an airplane. The first boss is fairly easy here too. Although the boss normally is bigger than Shinobi, the boss in this version literally dwarfs Shinobi. Letting off magic here is fairly abysmal, and no fancy animation used here like the arcades game at all. The controls feel very clunky here. It's just not very nice to control at all. Wooden, so to speak. I found when jumping to avoid bullets, I would press jump to do it, but it wouldn't respond immediately, but a nanosecond later, which caused several deaths. The ZX Spectrum's port of Shadow Dancer, released in 1991, of course by US Gold, it was available for both 48K and 128K Spectrums. Now, clearly a visually impressive game for its time, this one was going to be a challenge to port this over to a 1982 48K Spectrum. We have a nice theme to start the game with, where we can select keyboard or Kempston's controls. I'll use Kempston for this. It's not actually as bad to control as I was thinking it was going to be. It took a little while when jumping down to lower and upper levels, where down and action buttons need to be pressed in quick order to make this happen. Shooting shurikens works okay. Setting off magic, although a little basic, and no quick cutscene of Shinobi's face. All we get here is a few squiggles of lightning strikes. We don't get a map of the stage we're about to enter either here, which was a bit of a letdown considering this could have been easily done here. We get no music here at all, just some very basic sound effects. Controlling the K9 is pretty easy too. Keep joystick downwards whilst quickly tapping the action button. Your K9 then attacks just fine. Now, as I made it to the second level in Mission 1, there was no background visuals at all here. No airplane, no nothing. I then finished the level with walking up some stairs, but still no airplane in sight. It was like a stairway to heaven. All in all, this was a tough version of Shadow Dancer for the Spectrum, clearly let down by the hardware that really shouldn't have been taken on a game like Shadow Dancer at this point. Even with cutback elements, it just wasn't very good at all. Thankfully, in 2022, there was a remaster of this for the Spectrum 128K, which improved on several things, which is worth checking out. I am pretty sure that the Amstrad CPC won the best version of the 8-bit computers, although not brilliant by any means. It's more on the ZX Spectrum side than the bizarre Commodore 64 version. I'd likely say that this was very much like the Spectrum game, but just in colour of course. This looks fairly pixelated, but like I say, this is likely the best one here for the 8-bits. And remember, games back in the day wasn't played on a flat screen TV. They were designed for the current technology at the time, which is of course CRT or dedicated monitors. We actually have more of a thorough image of where we are here. It's an airport, and we know this because this version makes it very obvious with planes outside as we walk through the airport. US School released this port also in 1991 with everything else. In terms of the lack of airplane outside in level 2, this is much like the ZX Spectrum version here. There isn't anything. The boss section is also very similar. My guess is that either the Spectrum version or this version was ported and used on the other machine. Nothing out of the ordinary for developers to do this back in the day with these two particular computers. This one also only comes with sound effects too, but all in all I would rank this higher than Spectrum's as literally the same game but only in colour. Finally, we have arrived to a conversion where it is more of a full arcade experience, but this comes at the expense of an absolute racket that this game makes. At this point, I had to turn the volume down, and will do so with editing this version too. Normally when playing a game, it can be annoying having to start again once dying. In this case, I was more concerned about the noise this made when dying. The dog barking also made my eardrums bleed, I think. So as a game, it's okay. It's certainly an improvement over everything else so far. I wouldn't even say it's because this is a 16-bit conversion rather than a mere 8-bit. The truth is, US schools who release these games were notorious for releasing terrible games. I think that is widely accepted at this point. The game controls fairly well, spacebar releases magic, and the usual fire button and joystick combination to jump up to higher and lower levels. Something this ST version did have, which was a fairly good background for level 2. Although not mind-blowing, it was actually nice to see something in the background here. I made it to the first boss, as in all of these versions, let some magic off, threw around 6 shurikens at him and he died. He threw nothing at me, so not sure if this was some kind of unfinished boss here as a rush release. Something that could have been added, which wasn't, was some parallax scrolling in the background. We did have music here though, rather than just bleak sound effects which 8-bit computer versions had. Of course, this is when it wasn't being drowned out by ear-piercing sound effects. It wasn't too bad. I will end on a high note here for this version. I found the bonus stage particularly good. It looked much like the arcade game too. Let's take everything that the Atari ST conversion had and make it a little better. So firstly, with this Commodore Amiga release, the scrolling and movement is fairly smooth here. It is much brighter to look at too. Regretfully, even though the Amiga was fully capable of doing parallax scrolling, this didn't have any, which is pretty pitiful considering its older brother, the Commodore 64, actually did this. One bonus that I was really grateful with this version of the game was the actual sounds. The music was average and the canine barking sounds and dying sounds too was done properly, so no longer did my ears bleed. It's almost the same scenario which the Spectrum and Amstrad version had, virtually the same game but just a little better on another platform. Is this a great game or even a great version of Shadow Dancer? Hell no. I don't think any system had a decent home conversion, but working through each trashy version told me that out of everything, the Amiga likely had the best version. I warned you at the start of this video that US Gold released some terrible games, and its license for releasing Shadow Dancer on multiple platforms is pretty much a testament of this. I am also baffled as to why Sega's own version for the Sega Master System was so bad too. And that's it for ranking every Shadow Dancer home conversion today. So which pitiful release did you have? Was you happy with your Commodore 64 release? Personally, like I was saying, I think all of these were pretty bad, and in fact it's likely the worst home conversions of a particular arcade game I've ever done in this series. But anyways, as always, let us know what you played back in the day. Did you actually play this one in the arcade? I don't actually remember this one in the arcade. I personally played the Mega Drive version on my brother's Sega back in the day. But anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.